So thank you very much. I'm David Hume. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester, and I'll be chairing this session. I've got a little bit of a track record on this subject of women's economic empowerment because I've been looking at microfinance for 30-odd years. The aim of this session is to come up with concrete ideas, priorities, actions for the UN high-level panel on women's economic empowerment, which the Secretary of State has taken the lead role in and is continuing to play a major role in. And so we're looking in a way for very focused inputs about what should be taken forward, how women's economic position might be most improved. The Secretary of State will talk to us for about 10 minutes, but she's not here to demonstrate commanding control of this brief. She's here to listen and learn. So she has sort of insisted in setting it up so that she really wants to hear from you about what you think the priorities should be, about what should be taken forward. It would be good if we've got very positive things to propose, but if there are things that should be avoided, then also we should hear about those. We'll be starting off with comments from the Secretary of State. We've got some background notes in your briefs, but Justine Greening has been Secretary of State for International Development since 2012, entered Parliament in 2005 from a private sector background, and if you've been Googling or taking a look around, then you'll see that gender inequality or moving towards gender equality has been a very active part of her role at DFID, and certainly colleagues at DFID who one bumps into know that the Minister is always pushing ahead with trying to look at issues on gender inequality. After the Minister's talk, then we'll be getting comments from our three panellists. We've got Gabriela Zapata, who's doing a PhD at the Global Development Institute at Manchester at the moment in the Brooks Doctoral College on inequality of opportunities in Chile. She's got previous experience as a teacher and also has run a small business, so has direct experience of trying to be a woman working in what is generally a man's world in the economy. We've got Martin de la Harpe, who is Head of Sustainability at Flamingo Holdings. I think earlier on that was known as Findley's More. Martin's been working in that field for around 17 years. That employs 12,000 people internationally in a global value chain, which is involved in primary production of flowers and of vegetables right the way through to the distribution in the rich nations of the world. And the final comments will come from Stephanie Barrientos, Professor of Global Development, who most of you will know very well. Stephanie was researching these issues, researching women's economic empowerment before it was a major focus. If you look back at that, she was involved in the Ethical Trading Initiative, lots of big programs on cocoa and major changes to what Cadbury's and other companies have done on that. Most recently, she's been running the Capturing the Gains project, working with colleagues at Duke University and around the world in 17 countries, looking at how one can improve the conditions of primary producers and of ground level workers in global value chains. Okay, we welcome you very much to Manchester today, Secretary of State. This is an issue that we are very impassioned about, and you'll be getting a lot of comments back on that. I think you've also come to the right place because we have a reputation as scholar practitioners. We write the best papers, but we also engage and try to change the world, and so we really welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Dave. Based on what you've just said, I'm absolutely in the right place to have this meeting today, and it's just brilliant to be up here. I realise I've arrived just in the middle of a big building project that I think is just underway, but it underlines just how much investment's going into this amazing institution that's the University of Manchester, and it's one that DFID backs up by investing in ourselves, actually. So we do our Effective States and Inclusive Development research programme here that David is very heavily involved in. And I think the purpose of today's meeting is really about this being your chance to shape global action to empower women, which is something that I am determined that we make more progress on. and I'm a founding member of the UN high-level panel on women's economic empowerment. It was something the United Kingdom was very keen to see set up to provide a platform to get progress on this. And I want to hear from you about your experiences, your ideas, where you think the priorities need to be, but critically what you think the solutions are. So what are the big game changers that we can do that will make a difference around the world? And so I just want to spend a few minutes talking about, if you like, the scale of the challenge that we face, which I think many of you will be very familiar with, but Jen, a little bit about the DFID work to tackle those challenges, but then really my sense about why this outreach we're doing on the panel is so important, and a couple of other things as well. I mean, if you look at the scale of the challenge, I mean, it sometimes can feel bewildering, actually. And I've described this issue of women's rights and a lack of women's place in too many societies and countries around the world as the biggest unmet human challenge that we face in the 21st century. And I think it is. I think it absolutely is. And we've talked about it in terms of voice, choice and control, giving women more of a voice to be able to participate in their communities, in their politics, choices around what they get to do with their lives in terms of education and employment, and control, frankly, over what happens to them on a day-to-day basis in terms of their own bodies and, frankly, being able to stay safe. So we've really looked at this issue in the round, and if I kind of go through where are we at in those different areas of voice, choice and control. I mean, if you look at voice and participation, I mean, even here in the UK, only 30% of our members of parliament are women. And when I came into the quad area when I arrived today, of course in the very furthest away bit of the campus, as I then discovered, to get to where I needed to, and we walked all the way round, which is interesting in itself. But there's a blue plaque up there. And that's a blue plaque to commemorate a lady called Ellen Wilkinson, who was a graduate in history in 1913 and went on to become the first ever female Minister for Education, which is incredible, but that's over 100 years ago. And we still only got 30% of parliamentarians as women, and actually that's better than most countries. So worldwide, 20% of representatives in national parliaments are women. So there's that issue. There's the issue, of course, of women in the workplace, which is what this panel is really looking like. But there are still loads of barriers. I mean, in 17 countries in the world, women are still need permission from their husband to be allowed to go out and work. In 34 countries, women are not allowed to inherit. There are other places where you can't set up a bank account, you can't register a company, you can't own land title. These are pretty fundamental barriers to women being able to be economically active. And we know that in many developing countries, 75% of the so-called unpaid care that happens is done by women, which is another huge barrier to women being in a position to be able to go and be financially active and economically active, if that's what they want to do. You look at women's ability to have control over what happens to them. I mean, millions of women and girls around our world still suffering FGM, child marriage, something that DFID has really focused on. So there's no country that has yet achieved equal rights for girls and women. Many have gone a long way towards doing that. I'm proud that we live in a country that has made huge progress, but we've all got further to go. And even when I talk to, if you look at the sort of the women in my family and our journey. So I was the first person in my family to go to university. My mum went to her school, but talked to my grandma, who's 94, and she left school when she was 14, 15. And she told me her mum turned up one day and suddenly said, look, I've got you a job as a sort of servant, basically, in a house that, you need to go and work there. My nan, who was her mum, had left school at 12. So you sort of sense this generational shift. And I think what I really wanted to say is it's all taking far too long. And there was this World Economic Forum report that came out I think it was at the beginning of this year, end of last year, and it basically looked at education, employment, participation, looked at these three things, and sort of said, right, so let's extrapolate those trends forward. How long does that progress need to play out until we get gender equality? And the answer was 117 years. Seriously. So we're looking at the moment, in the absence of anything else, at basically 21, 33, 34. I don't think that's acceptable for women around the world. I think that timeline's far too long. We can't kind of accept a progression that is so slow in its pace in reality. So, and I don't think the world can. So this issue of girls and women is at the centre of what DFID has been working on. If you come through our doors in Whitehall, you'll see these 4 letters spelling girl that are really big, and I've got them there because we had them for the Girls Summit that we did in 2014, but I really wanted to remind our staff about one of these driving issues that frame so much of the work that we do. So they walk through the door every day and that's what they see, girl, because I think if we can help girls, then we will drive development. And this issue of financial and women's economic empowerment is really at the centre of that. And I think it's as much about rights as it is about anything else. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. And it's about the fact that actually when women have the chance and the ability to become financially independent and to be able to work, along with it come a whole load of other freedoms and, dare I say, dignity around control over the broader life that women are leading. And indeed, if you look at what this means, not just for individuals, but for countries, it's a huge bonus to get women more able to be economically active. There was a fantastic report by McKinsey. I don't know whether any of you have seen it, but if you Google McKinsey Women's Economic Empowerment, that came out, I think, September time last year, and they did some great research that said, well, actually, let's have a look at what the global economy impact would be if each country in a region performed on economic empowerment for women as well as the best country in its region. They worked out that that would add 11% to global GDP by 2025. I mean, that's a huge economic lever for us all to try to pull, not just for the individual impact it makes for women, but for the global economy. They worked out that actually if every country in the world was as good as the best countries, so if you did that globally, not just regionally, it's literally 25%, 26% extra global GDP, which kind of makes sense when you think about it, doesn't it? So if you think that broadly blokes are mostly working and probably about half the women in the world get a chance to work, that adds up to a missing 25% in a way of people who could be more economically active and more financially independent if they had the choice. So this UN Secretary General's high-level panel is about how do we really turbocharge women's economic empowerment then? What's it going to take to really shift the dial on this? It's a complex issue, it's multi-layered, it means different things in different countries, but somehow, and it's generational, but somehow we have to work out what we are going to do to shift this, because as it stands, progress is moving far too slow. And I believe that when people, and that includes women, have the chance to lift their nose and lift their sights above simply surviving day to day, that's when people start to be empowered to change everything else around them anyway. So this isn't just about enabling women to be able to be economically active, it's about enabling women to have the space, frankly, to be able to look around and say what they expect for their communities, for their children, for their country, and start to have the chance to effect change more broadly themselves. So the high-level panel's looking at this. We're looking at what's it going to take in terms of the legal framework, what do governments need to do. We're looking at what businesses can do, supply chains, to be part of helping tackle this problem. We're looking at this issue of unpaid care. What is the right way to look at it? What's the right way to deal with it? What What can we make in terms of progress on that? We're looking at the informal economy. The reality is that whilst many women may be working in the formal economy, actually overwhelmingly, this issue of jobs is more possibly as much about livelihoods for many of the women that we particularly want to try and help. There are enablers, the chance to, as I said, inherit assets, have a bank account, have a mobile phone, etc., that are also part of this. So it's about access, it's about the quantity and quality of opportunity, and it's about the enablers that I've just talked about, education, that mean women can actually become economically active. And what we're looking at is the best evidence, which is why I'm here. Because you are people who study the evidence and follow the numbers and really understand these issues probably to a more detailed level than I think most. And we are reaching out not just to businesses, not just to civil society, but also to people like yourselves, really, to get your brains engaged on this as well. There isn't another group of people who's going to come out with a great, wonderful, high-level panel report that isn't just a report about problems, but is a report about solutions. It's up to us, on behalf of those women, to think our way through this. So we're probably going to achieve success through what's in our hearts, but actually it's going to be what's in our brains and our ability to think our way through this problem smartly that is going to be the key to success too. So we've got today, there's a global online survey that's there that I would also love if you could find and fill in. And what happens after all of this is we have a meeting in Chile, which is where one of the co-hosts, the president of Chile, is a co-host on the panel. We have a meeting there in July time. Final product, if you like, is in September, where we basically come out with a roadmap of what we think needs to be done, pulling all this work together. I'm sure that there'll be more work after that around what's the action plan to then deliver the roadmap. But the point is, September's a key moment for us. The last thing I really just wanted to say was perhaps a little message closer to home, frankly, because what I've just been talking about is this most precious of commodities, which is opportunity. And this is an institution that is about opportunity at its heart, and the opportunities that you're all having as students here, many of you, but the impact that you no doubt have on the broader student body. And I can't be here without talking quickly about our own opportunity as a country that we have coming up, which is our decision on whether we stay or leave the European Union, and actually the real push to make sure that your generation has its say as part of that vote, and especially women here. So we're talking about voice, choice and control, but voice goes for the UK too. So I really just wanted to finish off by saying, if there's one thing I've learnt in this job, it's that these international institutions, whether it's the UN doing this high-level panel, whether it's the World Bank raising and investing money that really drives development, that's how you get these things fixed, these complicated global challenges that we face fixed, by working together. Personally, I think that starts with our own neighbourhood right here in Europe. But what I do know is that in the end, this vote will only be successful if young people play their role in it, and if women and girls, particularly women with the vote, use it. So if you have your tutorial students, make sure they're registered, please, because this is a once-in-a-lifetime vote probably that we'll have on the EU. And in terms of what it means for how we can make progress on women's economic empowerment, there's a close-to-home bit of this that we will want to be able to do. And that means us being able to influence the rest of this economic bloc that we're part of, that can be a huge driver for helping women to have amazing opportunities right on our own doorstep, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And frankly, how the vote on June the 23rd plays into it as well. And I just think we need to recognise that, everyone in this room is that we're all opportunity creators. So we're creating opportunities for ourselves, but we're creating opportunities for other people in all of the work that you're doing, all of the thinking that you're doing about how development can take place. Fundamentally, it's about trying to create a world where people have fewer barriers stopping them getting from where they want to get to, especially that group of people that tend to have more than the rest, which are women. So there you go, that's what I wanted to say. I wanted to thank you for all of your engagement. I know that you've been talking a lot about this already, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Secretary of State. Let me move that out of the way. And we now give the floor to Gabriela Zapata.
Hello, everyone. I'm very grateful to be here representing students of the University of Manchester. I particularly would like to thank Justine for including a student in this panel and Stephanie for inviting me. When I started thinking about economic empowerment of women, the first things that came to my mind were all the barriers that you mentioned and the impede us to overcome the threat to be treated as equal in everyday life and as well as in our professional life. There are several examples, like the one you said, that we can't open a bank account because we don't have enough money, or when we are not considered for jobs because of maternity leaves, or that we need a male guarantor because we can't have a mortgage by ourselves, which, by the way, happened to me. My father had to be my guarantor in a mortgage. Then I thought that as students, we are here not only to give our experience and ideas how to achieve women's economic empowerment, but also to become active agents to give momentum to this idea. I'm a PhD student, and my research topic is on inequality of opportunities, particularly analyzing how to measure it. These methods include gender as a circumstance that one can face. No one chooses to be born men or women. As a result, our outcomes, like income, education, and so on, shouldn't be different just because we are women, just we are belonging to an ethnic group or our parents' wealth. The idea of equalizing opportunities is very appealing to policymakers, as no one can be against equal opportunities among us. But the model used to measure equality opportunities in the labor market is not easy to interpret. For instance, in Chile, inequality opportunities is 19% for men and 17% for women in 2013. These figures might be reading as women having more opportunities than men, which is not true. Women have lower salaries, and also our ceiling, so the top salary, is lower. Thus, my thesis highlights how this measurement can be tricky and reinforce wrong ideas about the way that opportunities are distributed. When I read the documents of the UN panel about women's economic empowerment and saw its core idea that empowerment is not only the right things to do, but the smart thing to do, since business and the economy will benefit from that, I thought that this is also a very tricky idea. In 1869, John Stuart Mill used similar arguments to advocate for women's rights. He argued that the whole society would benefit from more educated women who entered into the labor market, including their husbands, because children would be raised better for smarter mothers. Undoubtedly, 150 years ago, we men needed this sort of arguments to be convinced that women's education and rights were worth it. So I see how catchy the slogan can be, and that could be very useful to convince men that they need more women in the economy. But I don't think this is the way that we need to be included if we really want to achieve women's empowerment. We want to be included in economic life and in every aspect of life equally because it's fair. It's a matter of justice and not about utilitarian efficiency. We deserve the same rights and opportunity not because we are useful to society or to improve the economy. The utilitarian approach will be reinforcing the idea that we are not in the same position as men. I'm convinced that in order to achieve equal opportunities for men and women, rich or poor, we not only focus on big policies like gender quotas or equal salaries for the same job, but also give attention to those things that most of the time we don't even notice because they are too normal for us, like how we are treated in everyday life. Real equality of opportunities is achieved when men and women, rich or poor, can freely choose the life they want to live and have the resources to do so. But if we have to change our behavior from a young age to be accepted and rewarded, we will never be able to develop fully our potential. Valerie Valkerdine research has shown that in the UK, until primary school, women have the same result as men. But at secondary school, women do worse in mathematics in order to be valued and accepted by their teachers and their male classmates. To achieve our goal of women's empowerment, we will need the support of smart people like John Stuart Mill was at his time. And also we need to increase our awareness as women and make visible this fact in order to actively advocate for women's economic empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you. And we now move to Martin de la Harpe.
Many thanks, David. Many thanks for the opportunity inviting me here to share our experiences of empowering women on our farms in East Africa. Flamingo work in horticulture, and our industry in Kenya is fairly new, having developed in the 1990s as the UK retail market expanded. At the start, our baseline resulted in a situation because of access to education. Most of the supervisory management roles were male, which was not good for business. In order to overcome the imbalance, a combination of policies, training, and proactive support has helped bring about change. We now have females represented throughout the business up to board level. As a start, firstly, clear policies were developed and integrated into our company handbook and worker induction. And secondly, training was rolled out at the supervisory level that included a strong component of anti-discrimination and gender awareness. The next stage to move forward was our developing independent gender committees, which were established and elected by their peers. These committees collect agenda items that affect them and their colleagues and meet monthly with management, discuss and agree solutions. Furthermore, training and capacity building of the committee members is also undertaken. In order to develop this further, training programs underlying root causes have also been undertaken, where all professional development of employees is undertaken. Educational loan schemes operate for formal qualifications to enhance professional options and social mobility. These provide crucial springboards, as many women had withdrawn from education to provide for their families and as a result were lagging behind. Much of our fair trade premium generated is also used for education, and I think this is a common theme which we're discussing today. To conclude, we would propose that working environments that promote women's empowerment and educational opportunities are vital to further empower women. In addition, when communities we work in thrive, so do we. So additional leadership programs such as Emerging Leaders in the community have had enormous benefits, where we've had approximately 1,000 workers through the program and have waiting lists as a result of the keenness for people to join in. The Leadership for Hope training has led to many spin-off businesses run by our workers, whereby they are empowered to start their own enterprises, and their success is humbling. So those few words were just a quick summary of the more practical aspects of how we've engaged with women empowerment in our supply chain. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Concrete ideas there, and we now move to Stephanie.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity of participating. I should just add to Martin's few words, which is that I've done research in Kenya for over a decade, and I have seen significant improvements for women, particularly in the flower industry, but also in other industries. And certainly your company has been part of that process, partly under pressure by NGOs in the early stages. One of those NGOs is Women Working Worldwide, which is based in Manchester and has offices up the road. So you can see it's a collective effort at the end of the day that puts the pressure that leads to the change and leads to positive outcomes. So I just wanted to say a little bit from a kind of research perspective, because I've researched these issues for a number of years. I really welcome the panel, and I particularly, if you look at who's on the panel, it brings together a real mix of large multilateral organisations, business, particularly IKEA, yourself, NGOs, including Oxfam and SEWA. And many of whom we at Manchester have close links to, including Oxfam and SEWA, and who's linked with SEWA is in the room. So I think it's a really important step forward. I agree so much with what you said, which is that whilst there's been progress is just far too slow. And one of the, people who know me will know it's my hobby horse, but I think one of the dimensions that I think hasn't been addressed sufficiently and could play a key role is to really promote greater gender equality through value chains and through using business as a lever, not just within their own companies, but through the value chains within which they operate, particularly in the Global South. So I just want to say a few words really about that. I mean, firstly, there's a lot about women entering markets and supporting women to enter markets, but the reality is that in the business world, increasingly it works through value chains. These are coordinated value chains that link actors at every level, from big multinational companies, which we will know about, through to suppliers such as Flamingo, through to small-scale enterprises, and then carrying on through, if you think right the way through all the linkages in a value chain, to the home workers who produce goods that will be ultimately sold in value chains, to the smallholder farmers who will be producing the original inputs. And women play key roles at all of those levels. And they particularly, and research shows it time and time again, are located where the incomes are lowest, where the returns are lowest, where the rights are least. That's where women tend to be concentrated. And yet I think this is a potential lever for change that we really need to be using more. Just as an example, there's a lot on textiles and garments, for example, and women are 70 to 80% of textile and garment workers. But if you look at the whole garment, cotton, textile and garment value chain, there are 350 million people in that value chain, or those interlinked value chains. And so therefore, going to scale, you can reach large numbers of women in places that you haven't necessarily reached before, and which I think just going through fragmented markets on their own, you're unlikely to reach. A number of lead companies, large companies, particularly UK companies, US companies, are becoming increasingly concerned about what they call about the social resilience of their supply chain. I'll put it in those. But there are many reasons why I won't go into that. But that is waking them up to the fact that when they're worried about the future of supply, will we have enough cocoa in 2020 to meet the demand for chocolate? If you're a chocoholic like me, this is something you seriously worry about. And the answer is, if things simply carry on as they are now, no. But an increasing recognition that there are millions of women who are involved in working in cocoa who are not recognised farmers and need support in order to move forward. And so therefore you have to think about the kinds of strategies, and I think potentially value chains are a lever. They're not the solution, they're not the kind of the magic bullet, but they're a lever for change. So for example, just taking that example of smallholder farmers, women in Africa and Asia are not recognised farmers largely because they don't have access to land tenure. They don't own the land. And yet, increasingly, it's recognised they do large percentage of the work, up to 70% of actual agricultural work in Africa in some countries is undertaken by women. Now, just an example from Kenya, which is that where through the value chain, needing to support those women, they don't own land, they can't get access to credit, they can't get the inputs that they require, is that some of the PMOs are now recognising the producer, not the farmer, and by recognising the producer, giving them support and giving them letters of support based on their role in the value chain as producer, will help to get them access to the credit. So there are ways, there are levers, but we need to be much more quick on our feet, if you like, to look for those and how they can be addressed. And that helps to address, I think, some of these fundamental barriers that if we simply wait for land tenure systems to change, we have got a very long wait ahead of us. But if we can start to look at the ways around it and use those levers, potentially we could be reaching millions of both workers, home workers and smallholders. And I think that's really where women are particularly concentrated. I think that there's a lot going on. Just for example, one UK supermarket I'm aware of has done a gender mapping of its supply chain. It has 5.8 million workers in its supply chain. This isn't in its supermarket, in its supply chain. 48% of those are women. They are now rolling out a gender strategy within their supply chain, and they're requiring all their suppliers have policies in place promoting gender equality. Through that, they are reaching 2.8 million women. So that's one company in the UK. So if you want to go to scale, you can't. This is a vehicle through which you can do it. Unnamed company is also working with DFID and has a number of smaller projects in place in different countries where they're promoting gender equality as well. So I also, just to wind up, there are a number of other bigger initiatives. I think one of the bigger ones especially is the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, which have been a combination of UN Women and the UN Global Compact. And I understand that companies who've signed up to that have now committed $300 million to promoting women's economic empowerment. So again, there are levers that need to be incorporated and to move forward. So I think progress has been slow, but I think if we can bring these different actors together, companies can't do it on their own, governments can't do it on their own, civil society can't do it on their own, but getting much more critical mass, much better collaboration, I do think we're at a point of change where we could begin to really address these issues at a more fundamental level and not just at a high level. So I very much welcome the process going forward.
Okay, well, you had a whole set of ideas there. We've certainly heard the progress is happening, but it's too slow. But it's not a council for despair or pessimism. This is for action or outrage to move forward. Why? Well, for equality, for human rights, for social justice, for efficiency. 11% of global GDP just waiting to be built on to improve people's lives. How to do it? This focus on jobs and perhaps livelihoods, because many women are working in the informal sector, and looking at the enablers, access to education, reformed laws, financial systems, and childcare, and how to move forward on those. Gabriella talked about the need for smart people. Luckily, I mean, there are smart people to take inspiration from. At this university we have Nancy Rothwell, number 10 amongst British scientists, running £1 billion a year business, driving the Northern Powerhouse, as well as employing most of us around here. We had our launch with Winnie Byanyima. What a crazy one. She trained as an aeronautic engineer here 30 years ago, a African woman. She smashed all of the moulds, and look what she's achieved. So these people around. We heard from Martin about some very practical things to do. Look at the data. It generally shows you, just right in your face, that women are not being treated equally. Change the policies, think about training, independent gender committees, specific programs, leadership programs. And then Stephanie's pointed out the possibility now of going to scale, seizing these opportunities through global value chains, but this is very much through coalitions of organisations, not by government, not by the private sector, not by the NGOs or the unions, but working together in clever and smart combinations to take things forward in this way. Now we want to hear from you. You've got the 2 questions down in front of you. What do you think are the top 2 or 3 issues preventing women from progressing economically? And even more important, what are your thoughts on the recommendations that the UN high-level panel on women's economic empowerment should take forward, because they'll have the greatest impact? Can you give us your comments or thoughts? If you introduce yourself, just tell us who you are and where you're coming from, and if you can give us this in 30 or 40 seconds. Who's going to lead the way? I know you're all dying to put your hands up. Colette?
Colette Fagan, Deputy Dean of Humanities here. I welcome all the elements of the jigsaw. The trick we know for advancing gender empowerment is getting the jigsaw pieces to fit together, to work together, and I would like to put 2 more on the agenda. The world is made up of countries at very different starting points, but the countries which have moved closest to achieving gender equality have sat within the European Union, have worked together, and are the Nordic states. And we've learned through there that over 30 or 40 years, some of the key ingredients which we need to be able to translate into other national settings are changing organisations, primarily in the formal sector, of course, because that's relevant in those countries, through action plans. We do them very well in public sector. We have a very good action plan here as part of the Equality Challenge Unit to set targets in the same way you set targets for student attainment, profits, etc., targets for diversity, and sensible plans to move that forward. And the other bit is not just changing girls, although I recognise the focus, it's what do we do with our boys, our blokes, our men. And if we are going to achieve progress, the unpaid work we do isn't just about getting lower paid women out to do the childcare so people like me can hold better paid jobs. It's actually thinking about how men do the unpaid alongside the bit we measure in the economy. Now, I know we can't just take the Swedish parental leave model and drop it into Chile, that won't work, but we need to think about how we can translate those lessons learned in affluent settings into areas which are growing vibrantly, so we don't wait another 40 years.
Thank you.
I'm Linda Shaw, I'm wearing a couple of hats. So I'm chair of Women Working Worldwide, which is the Manchester-based NGO that's been working with women workers in Africa and Asia for nearly 30 years, and our strategy has been to work with local partners to give women voice, to do research, to hear what their concerns are, and then to build advocacy strategies with UK corporates about how we can work together to improve their situation. So that's been a long-term strategy, and it is about those smart partnerships. It is listening to what the women are saying, enabling them to have a voice. These are the women who are, the women in the plantations and the factories, and we think that's critical, to work in partnership, to hear what their genuine concerns are, then to work with the corporates and others to push for better conditions and understand what their needs are. And the second hat I wear is with the cooperative movement, and I would like to suggest that we move on from the notion of the heroic individual male entrepreneur and emphasise the need for more collective forms of organisation and enterprises, that we give support through business, through credit, particularly through education, to more collective enterprises to improve women's livelihoods, whether they're smallholders or different forms, because that's the way that enables women who don't see themselves as rights holders, who don't have the confidence to set up on their own, to really enter into markets, but to give them that collective strength and power. I think that's often been neglected in terms of a kind of individual offer. Our work has shown that women are ready for this, they're used to working collectively, so let's move that into an enterprise framework more strongly.
Salama.
Salama Ibrahim, I'm a lecturer at GDI. Inspired by work that I've done on FGM in Egypt and Senegal, I think there are 2 main points to raise. One is our understanding of progress and the women's understanding of their progress. Because for them to speak up, to be able to even sell it on a collective market, which follows up nicely from the past comment, is progress. So we need to also, when we're assessing the situation, not be understanding from their point of view how they perceive that change. And the other point is maybe something we avoid talking about to avoid that paternalistic note, but coming from Egypt myself, I feel confident to say it, but social norms. Walking around the understanding, I think Colette mentioned men, but also men's understanding of what it means for women to work, that it's not necessarily a challenge to their patriarchal leadership, but actually a partnership, etc. So, and this takes an incremental approach to achieve so. Yes.
Nikki?
Great, thanks. Hi, Nicola Banks, also from the Global Development Institute. I've done extensive research with young women in Uganda and Tanzania, and I think what I'd like to emphasise is, yes, employment is absolutely at the centre of young women's problems, but I think it's sort of really important to emphasise that we have to look at economic empowerment within the much bigger, broader sort of situation of their social and as well as economic empowerment. In both of those contexts, my research has shown that young women don't identify a lack of capital or skills or knowledge as their biggest constraint. First and foremostly, it's absolutely a lack of self-confidence that they face, and that's a direct result of living in marginalised communities, having an absolute lack of role models or mentors around them, having very limited support from households and communities, and facing quite widespread discrimination. In this context, economic empowerment has to go beyond sort of this individual kind of programming basis of building skills or access to finance to address some of those major constraints. There are definitely some programs that we can learn from that aim to tackle those, so that sort of empower young women by providing safe spaces, access to life skill training, access to leadership. And I think we can learn a lot from them. But one thing that we don't know so much about them is what happens in the longer term.
Yeah,
so in impact evaluations, we see good progress in the first 2 to 5 years, but then we see that stagnate. Why is that? Is it just that the broader environment is absolutely providing a ceiling on the level of success we can have, and how do we start addressing those issues? Just also to mention, I think when we're working with young women, we have to do things a little bit differently. Traditional microfinance programs, I think, are probably too risky for young people. They have different time preferences, they've got different they've got shorter term priorities than older women. And I think that means we have to think differently about what we do. We're piloting a project with local partners in Tanzania that's kind of blending a social enterprise model with an asset transfer and traditional savings group scheme, and that's having really good results in the short term. So I do think we have to think quite differently. And lastly, I'd also second the comment about, yes, we have to focus on women and girls, but we can't do that at the expense of young men. I think young men in these communities, disadvantaged communities, face much higher expectations, much greater pressure to be self-reliant, and much greater anxiety and depression. And they're also indirectly constraining women both with the kind of risky behaviours and in that sort of more indirect fashion.
Secretary, is it okay if we keep on gathering? Do you want to come back, or
gather
we'll keep
away.
On? Sally.
Okay, first of all, apologies, I sound a bit like Mark Simpson because of my voice. I've got a cold at the moment. So I'm Sally, I'm from the Global Development Institute as well. And actually, at similar points to Slava and Nikki, but I work in Bangladesh in slum settlements there around water and sanitation. And one thing that struck me was that young girls and women, most of them living in slum settlements, do work in the garment industry. And I wanted to sort of raise the linkage between living conditions outside of work and infrastructure, and how important that is for access to work. Just to give a couple of examples, a couple of girls said to me, you really need to address the issue of sexual harassment. We have so much harassment on the way to work and coming back from work. Simple things like street lighting can make such a big difference. You don't want to walk down dark alleys after work. Water points, having a water point where you don't have to queue for 5 hours, or you don't have to queue for the sanitation chamber for 5 hours, makes such a huge difference to their daily lives. So I just wanted to kind of raise that point and give some personal stories.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Francisca Cosno, professor in poverty and social protection from Maastricht University and visiting here, so I'm very honored to be here. I can only second what has been said, but I would also like it back to the government perspective in a way. I also think, given that, for example, I also think that we know what the solutions are, but eventually what is lacking is commitment from various governments and also from the international community to push it through, and that has to do with the priority setting and agenda making, but also the funding which has to come to. I also think if I look, for example, at the Dutch government and childcare provision, what you need is a consistent government, consistent policy, so that you cannot have the situation one year we say, yes, we will provide affordable, quality childcare at almost for free, and so women start participating in the labor market, and 2 years later, oh, I'm so sorry, we lack resources, and so we will have to cut down on these opportunities. So more consistency will provide also, I think, many women with a kind of security and certainty that they can rely on, for example, the public policies, and it will allow them to take more risks as such and to adopt a much more forward-looking strategy. Thank you.
Over here and then in the back. So,
I'm Julie Orcott. I'm also with Women Working Worldwide, and I'm currently working with project partners in East Africa and Ethiopia, where we're working around living wage strategies. So I'd like to just move back a little bit to Stephanie's point about the levers and the opportunities within those global value chains to really scale up and to be able to address some of those power imbalances at different levels to make long-term meaningful change for women who are already in the formal workplace. So as they earn wages, it's not just about having a job, it's that the wage that they earn for that work is sufficient and adequate to meet their needs, and not to have them in continued situations where they're indebted, having to take on additional work, having to use transactional sex or other inappropriate coping mechanisms in order to make their way as equal members of society.
I'm Ken McPhail, lead for Social Responsibility and Humanities, and project lead for our business schools, business and human rights project. So it's really a comment following on from Stephanie and underlining, I think, the importance of the role of business, and a comment which maybe is slightly more technical, but how perhaps we can increase the leverage on business, possibly through the market in terms of ethical investment. Now, the issue is that we don't have the transparency and comparability around the way that corporations are reporting on the issue of gender and women's employment down the supply chains. Now, one way that you could do that is possibly linking the UN Women's Empowerment Principles to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and perhaps giving them a bit more of a kind of legitimacy in terms of a reporting mechanism. So that could be through the market, and then in terms of aligning principles and investment. And a second minor point, if you were able to do that and get the transparency and reporting from corporations, then other ministries within the government could then perhaps use their leverage as well. I'm thinking here through export credit agencies, it would be very easy to then build in some due diligence around women's rights and empowerment into the kind of funding that follows and flows through the export credit agency.
Admos. Admos, I work at the GDI. I think my point is essentially to highlight the fact that a majority of women in the Global South work in the informal sector. And I think that the panel should try and look at ways to make sure that much of this work in the informal sector is safe, is profitable, and that the working conditions themselves will allow people, the women who work within this informal sector to feel that they're secure enough to, let's say, retire. Are there provisions for providing pensions from the little work that they are doing? I know that some initiatives are beginning to happen where certain NGOs will allow women to put a little bit of what they earn, and at some point begin to say, I'm too old now to continue to work in the informal sector.
Final comment then from Judith.
First of all, thank you very much for organising today's session. I'd just like to share some experiences, first of all, from working for the German Development Corporation in Middle East and North Africa, in value chains, amongst other things, and also from my PhD research in Nicaragua in the cocoa sector. And the first point is really about the implications women's cooperative exporting argan oil to the European markets, which then also entailed some wonderful social opportunities for those women in terms of how the patriarchal society started looking at them, given their success in this field. So just a second Stephanie's point about the opportunities for value chains and business to leverage their choice of what they sell and what projects they support, to use that for the benefit of economic empowerment and implicitly then in terms of also social empowerment. But also to say from my experience in Nicaragua, I would also say that social empowerment obviously is not the only thing. I came across some wonderful women who were the pillars of the cooperatives that were selling cocoa, but because they lacked training and skills, they weren't able to capitalize on that in terms of economic empowerment. So also for CSOs or government agencies or development agencies, businesses that schedule any kind of capacity building opportunities to make sure that they organize them in such a way that women are able to participate and benefit on that, be that through scheduling, be that making sure they take place in a safe place, but also providing opportunities such as a study which then allow women to enter and have
Thank you. Okay, we're running towards the end of time now. I don't know whether the Secretary of State, would you like to try and pull that together in some way, or a large set of different ideas there?
Yep, 6 pages of notes later. Well, first of all, thank you. I think just the sheer breadth of the comments demonstrates, if you like, how difficult this is to crack. And, you know, the key is having all the pieces pointing in the same direction. There isn't one silver bullet. So in a way, what you're trying to do is set out this almost like a map of what the problem is, as in there's informal sector, you know, women are in different circumstances, totally, and we need to kind of almost segment that and properly almost understand what the different bundle of challenges are faced by each of those different groups, just to try and simplify it to an extent to be able to then drive policy differences. And I think then it's identifying the thing that really comes across strongly is just the networks that are there to drive change. And I think one of them is definitely government and policy. But I think what really struck me, and the reason I was so keen that this panel got set up, is a lot of it's not government as well. And as you were saying, Stephanie, sometimes even when there are challenges on, as it were, public policy, you can find routes around those. And actually, if there's one area that is often the most sensitive, and it's the same here in the UK, it's planning and land. And, you know, often that's a general challenge on policy, not just one in relation to gender. So I think this issue of saying that there are networks that we can use to drive change, one is business, one is civil society, you know, there's a supply chain piece of it, there's an institution piece of it, there's education, there's actually this investment in social programs that can, if we work smartly, have a feedback into economic programs, and we can make sure that economic programs feed back into social programs. So there's a sort of leveraging piece of it that I think we need to bear in mind as well. I mean, I could talk for a very long time about this. Transparency is absolutely key. This idea about how we start to, in the round, look at measurement, having got transparency, I think is really powerful. You look at one of the things that really drives public policy, and it's this Doing Business Index from the World Bank. You know, governments obsess over it. Nobody wants to be at the bottom of it or slip down it. And what it's doing is creating a race to the top. And that's fundamentally what we need to create in this area, is a race to the top, particularly for businesses, but also for governments in driving change on the ground. And I think you start that by having A, transparency, and then B, some measurement that enables you to start looking at what people are achieving. But I think in almost a safe way for businesses, kind of implicitly recognises that there's always more that companies can do. So I think that, you know, having spent a long time in industry myself before I became an MP, I mean, good companies really worry about their reputation. So in a way, we've got to shift this so that companies that are doing, I mean, a lot of them are taking risks actually to step into this area, because if they get it wrong, they get a lot of criticism, and yet it would be easier for them just to not bother doing anything in the first place. So what we need to do is make sure that the ones that are moving along, you know, the path actually stand out for being constructive and positive, as opposed to feeling like it's a big risk that they're running if they haven't got all the way. So and I think civil society's role in that, I mean, you know, this relationship between civil society and business is critical, and I think this is where it can really work effectively in terms of constructive transparency to drive the race to the top in the business world. The last couple of points from me, I mean, first of all, number one, IMF budgeting, working with financial, you know, treasury departments in governments is key. I mean, gender budgeting really is at a very, very, very early stage of being well understood in terms of how it can shape policy agendas. And it's one of the reasons why it's just great that Christine Lagarde is on this panel, because you think about all the financial reform work that the IMF works with countries on, and how powerful it could be if that had much, much more at the heart of it in relation to gender. And of course, when you look at the McKinsey work and the global economic lever that women's economic empowerment is, it makes a lot of sense for this to be a more central part of how an institution like the IMF and the World Bank look at their own policy approach. My last point is this generational issue, and you mentioned right at the beginning on, you know, quotas, etc. And I think what's emerging from this is there's a sort of best-in-class head strategy, and then there's a best-in-class heart strategy. And actually, if you're really going to be successful, they both need to be there. So what you need is probably tailored for the country concerned, strong, proactive policy. But in the end, it'll only really be successful in the long term if you have a genuine buy-in. So you've got genuine political will. So it's actually what people want to do. You can't force them to change their organisations. In the end, you can drive change by having some element of change that is mandatory, but in the end, you need to win the battle for hearts as well as minds, and that requires cross-party support, which means you don't get chopping and changing over the years. And that's why I come back to all of the work that you do. How do you get cross-party, broad-based political support for change like this? It requires an evidence base that's so incontrovertible that actually arguing against it just ends up looking a bit silly. So strong evidence is, in the end, what I think unlocks this. And that's really, where probably the work that you all do can really fit in and change things, and make sure that we don't go down a route that looks obvious but in practice actually might be counterproductive or less valuable than we maybe assume, which is also a perennial problem, as we all know, in development. So thank you. I mean, it's been so helpful. We've done quite a few of these different sessions now. It's interesting about the common themes that come through, but you've also put some other things on the table today that were different, and I think really, really helpful. So it's much appreciated. Thank you.
Okay. A few words of summing up. First of all, thanks to the Secretary of State for coming to the Global Development Institute, the University of Manchester, sharing ideas with us, giving us her time. But also, for most of this group, thank you for advancing this incredibly important issue. Thank you for putting this on the international agenda. You've done the right thing in taking this forward. So please do keep on proceeding with it. We are a university, so ideas are what we bubble around with, and certainly I think you've heard some of those, but we think corporate social responsibility, many of us, has run out of steam. It's business and human rights, which is a conceptual framework that may give us the next leg. Also, this idea about coalitions. No sector can do it itself. Finding people with the right values across different things who will find new ways in that. We can change policies, but if you want implementation, we need these cross-sectoral implementing capacities to come on through. In terms of our audience, then you've got the UN Global Online Survey. That's on www.uon.org. Look for the high-level panel and you can fill that in. We're going to ask all of you who want to, if you fill in a note just saying what you think the Secretary of State should focus on, please leave that behind. I'll maybe twist Gabby's arm to see if she can come up with an analysis that will really take us forward in terms of if there is some group thinking that we can find on that. Ask your MP, ask your representative about what they're doing with the high-level panel. You might also want to ask them about what they're doing about the UK's relationships with the EU, as was gently mentioned at that stage there. So there's a set of things to do there. Finally, it is, I think we need to think about working internationally, but working at home. If you look at the FTSE 100, the top biggest companies, there are 6 Davids. It's a great name, David. 6 Davids run firms in those. There are 4 women. How can the Davids be beating the women? I mean, what world are we living in the UK? So we also need to work locally as well. Thank you very much. Can we give a round of applause again?